So today I'm going to be talking about how we can enhance students' self-regulation using technology. And as Dr. Halse described, I really owe my being here to both her and to Dr. Tony Simon, who's the head of the Cognitive Analysis and Brain Imaging Laboratory, through my work in their translational research clinic working with children who have chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, which some of you may know as velocardiofacial syndrome or DeGeorge syndrome. I've really come to understand some of the needs that families have across the country, because we see children from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from Canada, from Great Britain, and in doing some of that work, it has really kind of been the impetus for my doing today's presentation. In doing that work, a lot of families have told us that although we give great recommendations in our assessments, it's very hard for them to access treatment. And indeed, that's really common broadly across the United States. In the US, about 20% of all children, which is about 15 million children, have at least one mental health disorder. And about half of those actually have two or more mental health disorders at the same time. Unfortunately, only about a third of those or fewer actually receive services, and only 17% of that 15 million children actually complete treatment. There are a lot of barriers to entering and completing treatment. There is a lack of trained specialists, as you heard Dr. Vismara speak about earlier this morning. And indeed, some of the research suggests that there will never be enough trained specialists out there. Geographic location is difficult for those people who are in rural communities, people who don't have very high incomes and maybe can't afford private health insurance. And then all the reimbursement issues that you heard Dr. Vismara Sr. speak about earlier this morning too. Language and cultural barriers can be a problem, shame about needing a therapist, and then family stress. There's limited time. You may not be able to find childcare, marital conflict, again, something Dr. Vismara talked about. And then really having families buy into the diagnosis and to the treatment plan all lead to difficulties for families joining mental health services. But there is evidence that technology can improve people's access to services. This can be computer-based, which is sort of standalone or self-help interventions, or computer-assisted treatments where there's a therapist that coaches individuals. This really then improves getting treatment at a lower cost. Treatment is administered with greater fidelity. In fact, there was a recent study that was published in 2010 that looked at how well therapists who attended continuing education conferences actually implemented the therapies that they learned, the evidence-based therapies that they learned in those conferences. And all those clinicians who are in West Haven, Connecticut, self-reported that they adhered to evidence-based treatments. Independent ratings of their actual treatment sessions indicated that less than 5% of the sessions were spent on the evidence-based therapeutic interventions. So therapists believe that they're implementing evidence-based interventions, but when independent people actually observe that, they are not. So technology can help with that, and technology also can help with reaching a broader ethnic and linguistic group. There was a study that was reported in 2006 by Munoz and colleagues that used internet-based cigarette smoking cessation in Spanish and English over 74 countries to 4,000 smokers. So really using computer technology can help us reach out across a broad spectrum of individuals. Technology can improve access through telephone, like cell phones and text messaging, to remind people to increase their adherence to treatment programs, to assess stress, for example, to count calories. It can be internet-based to improve youth resilience and to promote health-seeking behaviors, to promote smoking cessation, and CD-ROMs also have been available, such as to treat social phobia. And then, of course, we have telehealth for long-distance consultation and supervision, particularly to rural areas. But technology does have its limitations. Financial, of course, is a big one. A lot of people maybe not have the money who really need these interventions to purchase a computer or a DVD. There are also costs to the agency to keep up equipment and keep it up to date. Technological illiteracy, which I sure hope you don't see me do this today, but I am not very literate technologically. Biases that may indicate that treatment really involves a face-to-face relationship with a professional as opposed to with a group or as opposed through technology. And then there are ethical and regulatory issues. There's concerns about whether or not people can hack into the intervention that's going over the internet, and then there needs to be HIPAA-compliant encryption. So all of these issues are still needing to be worked out. But there's a very, very broad range of interventions that have been provided through computer and computer-assisted systems. And I've just pointed some of them out to you here with the references. There's also a really nice website out of Australia called Beacon that gives you a wide variety of internet options for interventions too. And you'll see some of the lists down here, alphabetized. Asthma, for example, autism spectrum disorders, bipolar disorders. And there's the website you can go to look that up yourselves when you have a moment. So what is self-regulation? You guys may have gotten a chapter that I recommended that you read by Adele Diamond, and I really appreciate her quote. If you want to help children with academic development, you will not realize the best results if you focus only on academic achievement, though at first glance doing that might seem the most efficient strategy. Counterintuitively, the most efficient and effective strategy for advancing academic achievement is to also nurture children's social, emotional, and physical needs. And that's what I'd like to talk about doing today, some very systematic ways to do this. Let me give you a more concrete example of what we mean by self-regulation. How many of you familiar of the book, which was also made into a movie, entitled Speak by Laurie Anderson? It received the 1999 finalist award for National Book Award for Young People's Literature. Have you guys read that book or seen the movie? Oh, well, good. Okay, one person. Okay, great. Well, I'm sorry. I hope this isn't too redundant, but it's old enough that maybe you won't remember it. I'm going to read you a little selection from chapter 18. It's entitled, the chapter's entitled, Student Divided by Confusion Equals Algebra. I slide into my desk with 10 minutes left in algebra class. Mr. Stetman stares at my late pass for a long time. I pull out a clean sheet of paper so I can copy the problems off the board. I sit in the back row where I can keep my eye on everyone, as well as whatever is going on in the parking lot. I think of myself as the emergency warning system of the class. I plan disaster drills. How would we escape if the chemistry lab exploded? What if an earthquake hit central New York? A tornado? Mr. Stetman asks if anyone can explain the Wang-Diddler's role in the negative Hotchkiss theorem. Heather has the answer. She's wrong. Stetman tries again. Me? I shake my head with a sad smile. Not this time. Try me again in 20 years. But he calls me to the board. Mr. Stetman, who wants to help Melinda understand how we work our way through this problem? Rachel? Great. Oh, my head explodes with the noise of fire trucks leaving the station. This is a real disaster. Rochelle, clogs up to the board, dressed in an outrageous Dutch Scandinavian ensemble. She looks half cute, half sophisticated. She has red, laser eyes that burn my forehead. I wear basic dumpster togs, smelly, gray turtleneck and jeans. I just this minute remember I need to wash my hair. Rochelle's mouth moves and her hand glides over the board, drawing funny shapes and numbers. I pull my lower lip all the way in between my teeth. If I try hard enough, maybe I can gobble myself whole this way. Mr. Stetman drones something and Rochelle flutters her eyelids. She nudges me. We're supposed to sit down. The class giggles as we walk back to our seats. I didn't try hard enough to swallow myself. We're going to analyze this in a moment to really understand how self-regulation demonstrates itself in this illustration. What's a definition of self-regulation? It's an integrated set of abilities or skills that draws both from executive functions and emotion regulation capacities that are invoked in the service of accomplishing both proximal and distal goals. In other words, self-regulation is crucial for adaptive functioning. Adele Diamond talks about the fact that when learning occurs in a joyous classroom, where children feel safe, secure, and accepted, and where they feel the teacher sees them for who they really are and genuinely cares, children can dispense with the dual task of always looking over their shoulder, of trying to contain their anxiety, anger, or hurt feelings while they're trying to learn. Instead, they can take the risk of trying something new and being wrong. Executive functions involve things like attention control, such as selective attention, inhibiting distraction. They involve discipline, remaining on task despite temptations not to. They involve self-control, such as giving considered and appropriate responses rather than the impulsive one. Working memory also is often considered part of attention control. And then, of course, there are more complex executive functions, such as mental flexibility, critical thinking, creative problem solving, and incisive reasoning. So let's review again that excerpt from Student Divided by Confusion Equals Algebra, and call out when you hear something that I read that reminds you of one of these self-regulatory skills that you have seen here. And I'll pause to try and give you a sense of responding. There's no right answer because self-regulation does involve a lot of skills. First, I slide into my desk with 10 minutes left in algebra class. What do you think that is? She's late arriving to class. Why? What do you think that is? Do you think that's discipline? Remaining on task despite temptations not to? Maybe there was some temptation, some cute boy in the hallway she wanted to talk to, okay? Mr. Stetman stares at my late pass for a long time. I pull out a clean sheet of paper so I can copy the problems off the board. So that's good. What's she doing there? She's exhibiting self-control, right? She's giving the appropriate response rather than an impulsive one, such as maybe hunkering down because he's really looking at her past with questioning eyes. I sit in the back row where I can keep my eye on everyone, as well as whatever is going on in the parking lot. What's that? Selective attention. That's right. Okay, good. I like how you guys are participating. Thank you. I think of myself as the emergency warning system of the class. I plan disaster drills. What's that? Maybe selective attention. She's getting distracted because she's worrying about what's going on in the parking lot. And she's definitely not showing discipline, is she? She's not inhibiting the inappropriate response. Mr. Stetman asks if anyone can explain the Wang-Didler's role in the negative Hotchkiss theorem. What's that? She's having to use working memory. She's having to hold on to these terms that he explained or that he indicated that he wants the class to understand and think about and retrieve information from her long-term memory to be able to answer that. But she can't even remember what the terms are. Heather has the answer. She's wrong. Stetman tries again. Me, I shake my head with a sad smile. Not this time. What's that? Self-control. She at least is indicating she doesn't know the answer, right? She's able to respond to that. Here's another example of working memory. Rochelle clogs up to the board, dressed in an outrageous Dutch Scandinavian ensemble. She looks half cute, half sophisticated. She has red laser eyes that burn my forehead. I wear basic dumpster togs, smelly gray turtleneck and jeans. I just this minute remember I need to wash my hair. Selective attention and working memory. She is just recalling these things that she should have done, and it's interfering with her ability to pay attention to and remember what the instructions were and what the other girl was going to talk about, okay? So those are some concrete examples of what we mean by self-regulation. Emotion regulation involves self-regulation because it involves enhancing your emotional arousal as well as inhibiting it or subduing it, what I'm trying to do right now because of my social anxiety. It overlaps with executive function, and it also includes motivation and alertness. What's interesting, if you guys were taking my pulse right now, you'd notice my heart was doing strange things. There's something called heart rate variability that definitely indexes attention and executive function and self-regulation. So it's a dependent measure, but there's some emerging evidence that I'm going to talk to you about that it may also be an independent variable that we can actually manipulate to improve executive function, attention, and self-regulation. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about biofeedback. So what do I mean by heart rate variability? Heart rate variability is the natural beat-to-beat change in heart rate. But if you listen to the heartbeat right now, you'll notice there's an even space from beat to beat, here to here, the same time frame between those. That's not normal, though. Our heart rates vary. That beat-to-beat interval varies in time. Sometimes it might be shorter, sometimes it might be longer. And that's what I mean by heart rate variability. Resting heart rate in the healthy individual is about 50 to 70 beats a minute. But as I said, it's not uniform like the sound that you hear. It's a desirable state when those intervals vary complexly. This characterizes an organism who's healthy and adaptive, much like a tennis player who's kind of there at their spot, kind of balancing from one foot to the next foot, being ready to go over this way or ready to go over that way. That heart rate variability gives your body a chance to respond to positive things that may be happening or threatening things that may be happening. It allows you to track demands from the environment, and it allows you to organize an adaptive response. If the variability between your heart rate is less, that's unhealthy. It characterizes poor attention control, it characterizes ineffective emotion regulation, and it characterizes behavioral rigidity. Individuals with low heart rate variability respond to neutral and harmless events as if they were unpleasant or threatening. Their defensive behavior system is overactive and they don't recognize safety signals. They respond to neutral events with overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system, and they're ready to either flee or fight. The traditional model of anxiety relates to this activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and it can be likened to a sticky accelerator in a car where our energy gets mobilized to either fight or flee. It accelerates the heart rate. However, there's some new research that kind of reminds us there's another system that's also is important in dealing with heart rate, and that is another component of the autonomic nervous system. So here you see in red the sympathetic nervous system, which I just talked about, is important for fight or flight, and it innervates the heart here. But Thayer and Lane talk about the neurovisceral integration model that talks about the other component of the autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the braking system on the heart rate. In other words, it can happen when you have bad brakes. The parasympathetic nervous system puts the brakes on heart rate. And if the heart rate will accelerate because those brakes don't work, and the sympathetic nervous system accelerates the heart rate. That's indicated in blue here, the innervation to the heart rate here, and we'll talk a little bit more about the brain area that's important for that. The underlying mechanism is that when you can chemically, through medication, block all the input to the heart normally beats at a faster rate than the rate that you have right now sitting here in front of me. The parasympathetic nervous system acts on the sinoatrial node, which you consider the cardiac pacemaker, through the 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve to slow down the heart rate. It affects the heart rate at a beat-to-beat level. The sympathetic nervous system is too slow to change the heart rate at a beat-to-beat level. The parasympathetic nervous system is what changes the heart rate at a beat-to-beat level. So the vagus nerve comes from the term for Latin that means wandering. And you can see the vagus nerve is very long and it goes through all parts of the body, not just to the heart. And it also innervates part of the mouth and the face, which is really important for social regulation. The vagus nerve comes off here. I'm going to show you this here in a more schematic diagram. This is the vagus nerve coming off the bottom part of the brain. So it would be like you're looking at me from this angle here. The vagus nerve has two origins. We're talking about the part of the brain called the medulla oblongata. It's located between the pons and the spinal cord. This is the fourth ventricle right here. Here is one nucleus of the vagus, and here's another nucleus of the vagus. In blue, that's called the dorsal motor nucleus, and in red, it's called the nucleus ambiguus. So you can see here's the origin of one nucleus, and here's the origin of the other nucleus. So there are two nuclei of the vagus nerves. The vegetative nucleus is this one. It's the older one phylogenetically, meaning it was developed when you think about the evolution of animals. It was the one to first develop, and it's responsible for the freeze and the coping strategies of reptiles. The vagus nerve has also a more recent origin, the nucleus ambiguus. This is unique to mammals. It's myelinated. What does that mean if it's myelinated? Who knows? How do nerves transmit when things are myelinated? Faster, that's right. So this is why it can communicate to the heart and regulate heart more rapidly than the sympathetic nervous system can. It supports calm behavior. The polyvagal theory plays on this notion between these two nuclei, and it says that evolution has shaped three neural circuits that regulate flexible and adaptive responses. They're organized phylogenetically, and the newer circuits, the nucleus ambiguus, if it fails, it will act first, but if it fails to provide safety, then the older circuits will be recruited, all in the answer to the question, am I safe? So here we have threat, here we have no threat, and when we have no threat, we can be relaxed, as the gentleman was commenting to me, and we can have comfortable social relationships. But as threat begins to accelerate, we will evaluate that threat and we'll decide, do we flee, do we fight, or do we do the reptilian response and pull in and hunker down and kind of slow our systems. The parasympathetic nervous system, as I mentioned, is in control of cardiac activity. When is that adaptive? Well, it depends on the threat. If it's a true threat, resources are mobilized appropriately, and the organism can shift from homeostasis to behaviors that reflect active coping, getting ready to fight or getting ready to flee. But if the threat is actually perceived when the context is safe, you mobilize your defensive resources unnecessarily, and that's what results in parasympathetic dysregulation, which is not adaptive. So this smart vagus that is regulated by the nucleus ambiguus helps us apply the brakes to slow the heart rate, which is acted on in milliseconds. It puts the brake on the sympathetic influences on the heart rate. Heart rate variability increases then because that brake is like you may be slowing down on an icy street. You're applying the brake gradually, taking it off, applying the brake gradually, taking it off, so your car doesn't spin out of control. And then just like I was showing you with the tennis player, this facilitates the ease that you can respond rapidly to environmental changes. But if the threat is overwhelming, the parasympathetic nervous system disengages and the sympathetic nervous system takes over, and you get panic or you get rage and your heart rate accelerates. Panic, me right now. Then, if you're really overwhelmed, and we see this in children who've maybe been traumatized through sexual abuse or physical abuse, your system becomes overwhelmed and the person becomes immobilized or limp. They become numb and their body is flooded with endorphins. This is the process that might trigger dissociation. And it's really considered evolutionarily adaptive because predators won't eat carrion. They won't eat dead meat most often. And so pulling in can be a very adaptive response. So the context and the vagal control of cardiac activity is very important. There is a dynamic change in heart rate in response to the context, such that you get, if you have that greater variability from the resting baseline, in an ambiguous situation, you have fewer internalizing problems, fewer externalizing problems, and better behavioral regulation. So that is, if you're a child in an ambiguous situation with peers, if you have greater variability in your heart rate relative to what it was at baseline, you're going to have fewer internalizing problems, fewer externalizing problems, and better behavioral regulation. Parent behavior can mediate this. There's some research that shows that negative parenting is linked to both behavioral and autonomic indicators of emotion regulation. Mothers who use more negative control, such as verbal disapproval, criticizing the child's behavior, derision, threats of consequences of failure, social humiliating, have children who have lower regulation of heart rate. In other words, less heart rate variability in response to that ambiguous social situation. And that lower regulation of the heart rate in the context of the social situation or the social challenge predicts more externalizing problems, particularly in boys. And it's likely to be more associated with aggressive flight or fight behaviors. What's interesting in this particular study, though, supportive parenting did not predict heart rate variability. But in a second one, this one by Calkins, 2008, it did. Supportive and warm relationships actually facilitated the acquisition of self-regulations so that mothers who offered their 2-year-olds more positive guidance and felt more positive towards their children and experienced less stress in the parent-child relationship had children at age 5 who were better regulated and had greater heart rate variability, even after the effects of physiological regulation at age 2 and behavior problems at age 2 were accounted for. So this is an example of the relationship between brain, higher structures in the brain, midbrain, lower structures in the brain, down to the heart. And so we see that there are errors going to the heart in this illustration, but a little bit later on, I want you to realize there are also arrows that go back up to the brain. This is sort of a circuit that just shows one path. And so the vagus nerve is regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and the stellate ganglia is represented by, is activated by the sympathetic nervous system. So you have two inputs to the heart. This system is called the central autonomic nervous system. And the prefrontal cortex, your frontal lobes then, inhibit the sympathetic nervous system, exciting the lower circuits here. And that's really necessary in modern society to inhibit unwanted responses like freezing or fighting. It's important for delayed responses, thinking before you act, and it's important for mental flexibility. When you have prolonged sympathetic nervous system, it can create excessive wear and tear on the body, and this is what's referred to as allostatic load. If you have prolonged prefrontal inactivity, you can have a person who's overly vigilant, they tend to become defensive, and they will perseverate. And so any of you who've worked with children who have 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, or kids who have autism even, for example, know that they tend to ask the same question over and over and over again, even though they know the answer. This might be one mechanism for that problem. This central autonomic nervous system, linked with other systems, may be the mind-body circuit that we've heard people refer to. It links emotion and physiology, determines physical, mental, and behavioral health. So let's talk a little bit more about affect regulation. Individuals with anxiety disorders are less able to flexibly shift their attention away from possible indicators of threat and signs of potential danger. This is called attentional bias. Have you guys heard about that term, attentional bias? Some yes, some no. Okay, so this is what's referred to as attentional bias. These people are excessively vigilant and they continuously scan their environment to guard against threats. So they don't shift their attention away from neutral or innocuous events, and they don't become used to or habituated to neutral situations. This tendency to respond in a defensive manner reduces the number of options the person will explore. Their world begins to shrink because they're not willing to go out there and try things because they're perceiving them as threat. In turn, as I said, this reduces the number of experiences they can have to confirm or disconfirm whether or not something is threatening. And so you get a negative spiral of ever narrowing and restricted behaviors. So what can we do to improve self-regulation? Well, I'm going to be talking about 3 interventions, one for anxiety, one for working memory, and one for heart rate variability. How many of you guys have heard about Coping Cat and Camp Cope-A-Lot? Please raise your hands. Okay, just a few of you. How many of you have heard about Cogmed working memory training? A few more. And how many have you heard about heart math or coherence biofeedback? A few more. Okay, a little bit, about as many as heard about Cogmed. I'm going to try and give you some examples of each of these interventions today. Anxiety disorders in children are common and they're impairing. It's the most prevalent mental health disorder in children. It's very comorbid with other conditions. It occurs about 15 to 24% of kids who have ADHD and about 9% of children who have oppositional defiant disorder. The community prevalence is about 3 to 8% for anxiety disorder. In younger children, it's equally common among boys and girls, but among adolescents, it's much more common in females than it is from males. And you can get disorders that often follow anxiety, such as depression, eating disorders, and substance abuse. Cognitive behavioral therapy and medication can improve anxiety substantially. Walkup and colleagues reported a study of 488 children that range in the age from 7 to 17-year-olds. 21% of the subjects were minorities, including Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, American Indians, and Pacific Islanders. 25% were of low socioeconomic status. The children were either assigned to medication, cognitive behavior therapy, medication and cognitive behavioral therapy, or a placebo drug. Under the medication, 55% improved very much. Under cognitive behavioral therapy only, 60% improved very much. With both, 81% improved very much. And there is a placebo effect, which is typical, about a third, of about 24%, a quarter to a third. These are effect sizes. Effect sizes really kind of speak to more than just statistical significance. They speak to how meaningful was the change. An effect size of about 5.5 or more is considered a large effect size. An effect size of about 0.2 to 3 is considered a moderate effect size. So you can see the effect size for the combination was very good. So the therapy that was used in that study is called Coping Cat. And from Coping Cat, there has been this intervention called Camp Cope-A-Lot that's been developed. This is a technologically assisted intervention. It's offered on a CD-ROM called Camp Cope-A-Lot. It's 12 sessions. It's for children from 7 to 13 years. The first 6 sessions on the CD are self-guided. The last 6 sessions are coached with a therapist. It's designed for broader dissemination, so you don't have to be a cognitive behavior therapist to do it. There is, in fact, a CD, which I'm going to be showing you, that trains therapists to use this program in cognitive behavior therapy. It's called CBT for CBT, which is computer-based training for cognitive behavior therapy. It requires fewer therapist hours, which again makes it more easy to disseminate. A randomized control trial was presented in 2010 using Camp Cope-A-Lot. 49 children with anxiety disorders from the ages of 7 to 13 were randomly assigned to either Camp Cope-A-Lot or to Coping Cat or to an attention control condition that used a computer. About 16% were minorities in this study. You can see that really Camp Cope-A-Lot and Coping Cat had relatively equivalent benefits, maybe a little bit more for Camp Cope-A-Lot, and the control condition really didn't have very much effect. And both the children and the parent were satisfied with Camp Cope-A-Lot and the individual cognitive behavior therapy Camp Cope-A-Lot. It was better than the attention control in both situations. So what's Camp Cope-A-Lot like? Well, the characters are diverse. It's automated audio, they're interactive activities, videos, written scripts, schematics, and mnemonics. Characters in cartoon shape, and there are video games at the end to reward the child for participating. But there's some of the practicalities about implementing it. You can buy a base package for $200, but if you work in an agency, you can buy a package that 10 different therapists could use for 10 different patients for $2,000. And there are the systems requirements for the computer. So with children who have developmental disabilities, as this lady was asking, what's the maximum language age? Well, it's developed for children as young as 7, but of course some 7-year-olds aren't even going to really be able to understand that language. So you can still use components of it, though. There hasn't been research done with using Camp Cope-A-Lot or Coping Cat with children who have disabilities, although there has been one case study that's reported using Coping Cat. But you have to really de-emphasize some of the language, like the thermometer, where children are trying to rate their feelings. That's often difficult for them. And emphasize more coping skills, like knowing your own body cues of anxiety, relaxation training, problem solving, and using rewards like activity to manage your anxiety. Be concrete and lots of repetitions. But I think even that for a lot of our developmentally disabled children is going to be too much, which is why a little bit later on I'm going to be talking about biofeedback. Okay, let's talk a little bit now, shifting from anxiety interventions to self-regulation and working memory. How many of you guys have ever been anxious and found you couldn't pull up the word that you wanted even though you know what the word is? Okay. Or you're so anxious you can't remember what the person just said. Okay, great. Yeah, I knew you guys would understand. So we talked a little bit earlier about the central autonomic network and that the prefrontal cortex inhibits sympathetic activity at the subcortical levels. But the central autonomic nervous system also has innervation that goes from the heart to the brain, as I mentioned. The prefrontal cortex is important for working memory, sustained attention, behavioral flexibility, and mental flexibility. And as I've talked with you about, it's also important for heart rate variability. Autonomic imbalance can be associated with attention problems and poor cognitive control, and it can interfere with working memory. What is working memory? It's the ability to keep information in mind for a short period of time and to be able to use the information in your thinking. It's a system for temporarily storing and manipulating information necessary for a wide range of tasks. It's considered the search engine of the brain. It's important for everyday life because it processes all stimuli that we encounter. It delegates to different parts of our brain so that they can take action. It allows us to block out unnecessary information, and it keeps us updated on what's happening. It focuses on what's important now. Working memory is disrupted when a person is anxious. Worry and rumination seem to consume working memory resources, so working memory decreases. Amir and Bomea in 2011 studied socially anxious individuals and found that they recall significantly fewer neutral words, like chair, than their non-anxious controls. Socially anxious individuals recall as many threat words as non-anxious control recalls, and socially anxious individuals remembered more threat words than neutral words. Since there was a bias to detect threat, individuals with social anxiety need less attention control for threat words than for neutral words. Socially anxious individuals process threat words more automatically, and threat stimuli may be retained in working memory relatively more efficiently than neutral information. Working memory is very important in childhood because it supports learning, it's associated with achievement in reading and mathematics, and it's a very useful prospective indicator of academic performance. Unlike IQ, it's free from socioeconomic status and crystallized knowledge that's been acquired on the basis of experiences at home, school, and in social situations. Children with poor working memory make poor academic progress. Of 300 children with poor working memory, 83% scored poorly on reading or math tests, and the vast majority scored poorly in both areas. And it's important for successful learning in the individual classroom. When working memory loads in classroom activities are too high, Children will forget crucial information like the names of the theorems from the excerpt that I read you from Speaks. They will fail to successfully complete tasks, and their learning rates will be slower. About 10 to 15% of all students in mainstream classrooms have working memory deficits. One thing that has been developed to improve working memory is called Cogmed working memory training. This also is a computer-based intervention. Here's an example of the website with the web address. You can look it up yourselves. It has been used in California, in Dinsmore, California, and can read about that on their website. It used to be believed that working memory was fixed, that it was not changeable. But much like you can change your muscle strength and your muscle flexibility by exercise, you can also improve working memory by exercise. And these changes can be strong and long-lasting. This is the individual who helped develop it, Torkel Klingberg out of Sweden. And it can help people who were born with a deficit in working memory. It can help people who have a deficit through a brain injury. There's studies using veterans coming back from Iraq, for example, and Afghanistan who've suffered concussive injuries that have used Cogmed. It can help people who are declining in their working memory because of the natural aging process. And it can help people just improve their performance, like attorneys who may be standing up on their feet and they want to improve their working memory. So it's useful for a variety of situations. There are 3 programs, one for preschooler, one for school-age children, and one for adults. All of the products use the same design, but the visual illustrations are what change. Game development has important, psychology has important contributions, and neuroscience has important contributions to the development of Cogmed working memory. These are studies that have been done to demonstrate the efficacy of Cogmed. The ones indicated with the blue asterisk are independent. So it's not just the researchers themselves proving the efficacy, it's independent labs, which is really critical in science. So these are some of the studies that I thought were very important because they used control groups to compare the efficacy of Cogmed. These are the different samples that have been used: kids with ADHD, kids with weak working memory, kids with ADHD and learning disorders, and kids with ADHD and other comorbid conditions on medication. This is the effect size after Cogmed, and then 4 to 6 months after Cogmed. Parents reported a significant improvement in symptoms of inattention, meaning children paid more attention, reduction in hyperactivity, impulsivity. They were better able to follow instructions in a classroom simulated task. Their math reasoning improved, reading comprehension improved, their report of symptoms that load on the DSM-4 inattentive subcomponent improved, metacognitive and planning and organization skills improved. And then 4 months later, you can see the improvements here. So these are some Klingberg studies and independent studies that looked at the efficacy of Cogmed. There was one study that has looked at stimulants versus Cogmed. This was a longitudinal study that took 25 8 to 11-year-olds, looking at them off medication at time 1, on medication at time 2, after training and on medication at time 3, and then 6 months follow-up. And you can see, compared to time 1 when they were off medication to time 2 when they were on medication, the only significant benefit, and it was a moderate effect, was on visual spatial working memory. But once the children were on both medication and after taking Cogmed training, you can see a variety of parameters improve significantly. Short-term working memory, visual spatial, verbal working memory. So it has efficacy over and above medication. Or I shouldn't say over and above medication, because these kids also were on medication. It does supplement medication, and it improves a little bit beyond what medication would be expected to improve. Cogmed is very structured. It's a supported process. It's supported by coaches calling the family and giving encouragement to the child, and the parent, who is sort of the child's training aid. There's a wrap-up session at the end, there's a structured interview at the beginning, and then there are also optional extension training trials. It's 25 sessions. It's interactive online, so the lady who asked me about can you get it online, you will load the software on your computer and then it links online, but it's not free online. The sessions take about 30 to 45 minutes daily, 5 days a week for 5 weeks. As I told you, there's a coach that supports it. The internet link tracks people's training results. The coach calls in weekly. The parent serves as a training aide. And then, like I said, there can be extension training afterwards. Has anyone had a child who's participated in Cogmed Working Memory yet, either as a parent of a child or as a therapist who's worked with a child? Okay, I have done Cogmed Working Memory training myself. And I tell you, it is challenging. And I'm going to show you some of the exercises about it. And you have to have people, children and parents, who are really motivated to do it. But it's very energizing and it's fun. And that is part of why there's very nice compliance with it, as well as the coaching. Okay, so what's Cogmed like? So I'm going to show you some of these exercises in actuality. But just imagine here, there are going to be little lights that blink on. And then you have to take with the mouse and blink on the lights that you just saw. This one, the disc rotates, lights blink on, and then it rotates back. And you have to remember the positions of the lights when it was rotated. This one, you hear numbers, and then you have to press the numbers on the keypad in the order that they were said, or there's another one where you have to do it backwards. So you can see the short-term visual spatial working memory only had an effect size on medication of 0.07, and then on medication and after Cogmed 0.66. That's more. Yes, that's a larger effect size. This is a negligible effect size. What? Working memory, visual spatial. So this is the effect size with medication only, and then this is the additional effect size with medication and Cogmed. So it's an additional 0.15 improvement because this is already taken account for. Because this is already, they're on medication. We didn't take them off medication. They're on medication already. So this is their threshold, and then it added an additional 0.15 effect size. Okay, so this is sort of the visuals for the adult version of Cogmed, not quite as interesting. And then here's some of the visuals for the preschoolers, very, very cute. Here's some of the activities, some of the visual spatial exercises. For Cogmed Junior, you do 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 5 days. And here are some of the references that support the efficacy. It has shown changes in dopamine receptor binding after Cogmed working memory training. Dopamine is one of the key deficits in ADHD and the target of current stimulant medication. It's also increased prefrontal and parietal brain activity, key areas for cognitive processes. Cogmed Practicalities. Our research colleague at the Mind Institute who facilitates the ADHD program, Julie Schweitzer, has some research studies going on now where she's compared Cogmed to behavior training for parents. She's also used some very innovative outcome data showing that Cogmed has actually reduced the motoric overactivity of kids with ADHD as well as improving their attention and concentration. Here's some information about the practicalities of what you need to do Cogmed. So let's talk about the last thing, heart rate variability training to improve self-regulation. Self-regulation often is a matter of reflecting calmly and inhibiting action. In other words, applying the vagal brake. That redirects blood flow and glucose from the large muscles that support fleeing and fighting and allows more metabolic activity to occur in the brain. We talked a little bit already about the central autonomic network and the fact that information goes to the heart and also from the heart. Sensory information from the heart is fed back And when patterns of heart activity are erratic and disordered, such as during emotional stress, the corresponding patterns of neurological signals that travel from the heart to the brain produce an inhibition of higher cognitive and emotional functions. In contrast, the more ordered and stable pattern of the heart's input to the brain during positive emotions has the opposite effect. It serves to facilitate cognitive function and reinforces positive feelings and emotional stability. Heart rate variability training has been used in a number of medical conditions and a number of mental health conditions that you see put up here with some of the references if you're interested. People can achieve maximal control over heart rate variability within about 4 to 6 sessions. Unless there is some monitoring, there is some initial risk early that people may hyperventilate when they're doing heart rate variability training, but there are no other iatrogenic effects that have been recorded. There are portable monitors that are available for home training without the assistance of a therapist. Those are the M-Wave 2 and the stress eraser. And there has been research that shows things like the stress eraser are as effective as going into a clinic and working with a biofeedback professional. Heart rate variability training is emerging for children's self-regulation, and it's really been pioneered by the people at HeartMath here in California. So what is biofeedback? Biofeedback is a process that lets an individual learn how to change their physiological activity in order to improve health and their performance. Precise instruments measure physiological activity such as brain waves or heart function, skin temperature, and these instruments rapidly and accurately feed back that information to the user. The presentation of the information, often in concurrence with changing thoughts, behaviors, or emotions, supports the change in the physiology over time. And over time, these physiological changes can endure and persist. Biofeedback has been used to influence breathing, like for people who have asthma, heart rate variability, which I'll be speaking more about, skin conductance, the amount of sweat on your palm, for example, skin temperature for people who have conditions like Raynaud's, or it's also used in biathlon training, or the military uses it when you're out in the cold so you can warm your fingertips so you can shoot your rifles more accurately. Surface EMG for things like headaches, and also EEG has been used for kids who have ADHD. EEG biofeedback is called neurofeedback, and it is considered an efficacious intervention for both epilepsy and ADHD, as well as for other conditions. For ADHD and learning disorders, however, it usually requires about 40 to 50 sessions of about 40 to 60 minutes each, so it's quite time-consuming. There also has been some research that suggests that people go out and buy the EEG equipment without having a healthcare professional working with them. It's sold, in other words, to lay people, and it has been used improperly and has triggered a variety of iatrogenic effects. These include things like emotional lability, triggering vocal tics, behavioral regression, headaches, stress incontinence, slurred speech, and seizures. So it's very important, if you're going to be recommending a child use neurofeedback, which is feeding back the brain waves, that they work with a professional. You don't just buy it and do it at home. It's amazing what kind of equipment is out there that people can buy and use at home. I'm not going to be talking about EEG today. I'm really going to be talking about biofeedback of heart rate variability. These techniques enhance vagal tone and increase heart rate variability. They might reduce panic and anxiety, buffer cardiac responses to threat, and perhaps improve executive function. The HeartMath people are the ones who really have studied this using something that they call coherence training. So they attach sensors that detect the beat-to-beat variability in heart rate and also in respiration. The computer monitor then displays this information to the student via a visual and an auditory information, and you then see some of the changes visually yourself. The goal of heart rate variability is to train somebody to breathe at their resonant frequency. This is the breathing rate that maximizes respiratory efficiency. It coordinates the peak of inhalation, as I showed you, when oxygen is most concentrated in the alveoli, with the maximum heart rate. This increases the gas exchange efficiency. For the average person, the resonant frequency is about 6 breaths a minute, which is much slower than what our normal breathing is, which is about 12 to 17 breaths a minute. This resonant frequency varies, though, individuals. It can be as low as 4.5 breaths a minute to about as many as 7 breaths a minute. And that's why it's often helpful to have a professional who can determine what your own resonant frequency is. When the breathing rate and the heart rate oscillations are synchronized and in phase with each other, because of the effects of the baroreceptors on the heart, the blood pressure oscillates in 180 degrees phase shift. This phase shift only occurs when one is breathing at one's resonant frequencies. So in other words, as one inhales, the heart rate and the blood pressure go down simultaneously. That decrease in blood pressure stimulates the baroreceptors in the heart, and those also then increase the heart rate simultaneously, further enhancing respiratory efficiency. When you are breathing at your resonant frequency, you are entraining other physiological systems, your blood pressure and your brain waves. The sympathetic nervous system activation decreases, parasympathetic nervous system activation increases, and your body is in a very highly efficient state. All of your symptoms are in synchrony, and this is what heart math calls psychophysiological coherence. After training, heart rate variability at baseline was significantly higher in the trained group than in the control group. In other words, these kids actually changed their set points, and the effect size ranged from 0.58 to 0.64. That's a large effect size. When they were preparing for a stressful test activity, the coherence in the trained group increased their heart rate variability. The effect size was from 0.72 to 0.8. Again, a very large effect size. In other words, the kids who were trained responded to the challenge and the threat, managing their emotions better and their psychophysiology better than the control subjects who were not trained. Test anxiety also changed. It was lower in students who participated in the coherence training. The effect size ranged from about 0.26 to about 0.48. And among students who had the greatest test anxiety at the study's onset, coherence training significantly improved their heart rate variability at the baseline after they had done training during the stress test, and also actually improved their anxiety during the stress test in and of itself. We also saw some improvement in test performance, although again it's a little bit less clear to interpret this because of the initial baseline effect differences. At baseline, the experimental group had a language arts score of, the control group had a language arts score of 394, the experimental group much lower at 348. These kids, many of them were English language learners. English was their second language. But in an analysis, they did show some marginal improvement in their English language scores at 10th grade after they had improved their intervention with a moderate effect size of 0.31. So again, that's pretty amazing given that the bias was not to be able to find results. And Bradley stated, "This is the first study that we know of to show that high school students' heart rate variability can be increased over a relatively short period of time, that is 2 lessons per week for 1 semester done in the school, and that such an improvement in autonomic function can be accomplished through a supplementary classroom program. Not only had the high test anxiety subgroups overall heart rate variability increased at time 2, resting baseline recording, there was a significant reduction in feelings of stress, anger, disappointment, sadness, loneliness, and depression, which was accompanied by a large and significant reduction in test anxiety." In regards to working with anxiety, Camp Copilot has been designed to be implemented by practitioners who are not yet trained or experienced in CBT for youth. It has a DVD that you can use to get training in it. It's designed to be disseminated broadly, and it reduces the amount of therapist involvement because kids do the first 6 sessions themselves. Cogmed working memory has been successfully used in public schools, and then heart rate variability coherence biofeedback has also been successfully used in public schools. Because the supply of practitioners who are adequately trained in effective protocols is not likely to catch up and the needs for services in the future are likely to increase. Having technologies like these that we can test and maybe find some other ways to offer them, perhaps through telemedicine, will be very, very beneficial. We might be moving towards what's called a step care model, where first people use a book or a CD-ROM. Maybe then they can go on to a self-help group. Then maybe they use a CD-ROM that's supported by a therapist, and then maybe web-based applications, and then finally the more costly one-to-one face-to-face therapist intervention. Who might these interventions not benefit? Kids who have difficulty reasoning abstractly and using language might not benefit from CBT and can't cope a lot. Cogmed might be useful for them for working memory, but not necessarily for anxiety. You remember I told you that kids with significant anxiety and epilepsy should not use Cogmed because it can trigger epilepsy in kids who have photosensitive epilepsy. Biofeedback doesn't require language. It just requires you to be able to see and or be able to hear. So that might be more useful for individuals with developmental disabilities, but it's not been evaluated yet with that group. So consider a little bit how you might be able to implement these interventions in your own agency and practice. All right, well, thank you guys so much for your attention.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.